Think back to when you were 7 or 8 years old. You're standing in a store, staring at a toy you desperately want, and your parents give you the standard line, "We can't afford it. We don't have enough money." To a child, that's a logistics problem. You know money comes from a bank, you know the bank gets it from the government, and you know the government has a machine that makes the stuff. So, the logic is flawless. Why don't they just make more? It seems like the ultimate life hack. If a country is in debt, print the debt away. If people are starving, print them a grocery budget. It is so simple, so undeniably logical, that it feels like a secret the adults are keeping from us just to be difficult. But then you grow up. You hear words like inflation, and you're told quite sternly that you can't just print your way out of a problem. You're told it's dangerous, that it leads to disaster. But here is the part they rarely explain clearly. Why? If I gave you $100 right now, you would be richer. That is a fact. If I gave everyone in your city $100, the city would feel a surge of prosperity. But if the government gives everyone in the country $100, something strange happens. The magic starts to evaporate. The money doesn't change, but the world around it does. Today, we are going to look past the ink and the paper. We are going to explore why a $100 trillion bill can be worth less than the lint in your pocket. Because, as it turns out, money isn't what we think it is. It isn't wealth. It isn't even value. It's something much more fragile. Welcome to the explanation of the most dangerous good idea in human history. Let's talk about why we can't just print more money. To understand why the printer isn't a magic wand, we have to start with an uncomfortable truth. Money is not real, at least not in the way we think it is. We treat money like they have an inherent soul, like they are, in themselves, wealth. But they aren't. If you were stranded on a desert island with $1 billion in cash, you'd be the richest person in a graveyard. You can't build a shelter out of the notes, and they won't keep you warm for long if you burn them. True wealth is stuff. It's the grain in the silo, the time of a surgeon, and the electricity running through your house. Money is just the accounting system we use to decide who gets which piece of the stuff. Let's simplify the entire global economy down to a single, isolated island. On this island, there are only two things: 10 loaves of bread and 10 $1 bills. In this tiny economy, the math is easy. Each loaf of bread is worth exactly $1. That is the price. Now, imagine a crate washes up on shore. Inside is a printing press and a stack of paper. One of the islanders gets excited and prints 10 more $1 bills. He hands them out. Now, everyone feels twice as rich. They have $20 total. They go to the baker to buy bread. But there's a problem. There are still only 10 loaves of bread. The baker sees everyone has more money, and he sees his bread is in high demand. So, he does the only logical thing. He raises the price. Now, each loaf costs $2. The islanders have more money, but they don't have more wealth. They still only have 10 loaves of bread. The only thing that changed was the amount on the price tags. This is the most basic definition of inflation. When you increase the supply of money without increasing the supply of stuff, the money simply loses its flavor. It becomes diluted. For most of human history, we were terrified of this island effect. We didn't trust ourselves with the printing press. So, we tied our money to something we couldn't just make more of: gold. Under the gold standard, a dollar was a legal claim on a specific amount of shiny yellow metal sitting in a vault. If the government wanted to print more money, they had to go out and find more gold. It was a physical leash on the economy. It prevented politicians from spending money they didn't have because the math wouldn't allow it. But gold is heavy. It's hard to move. And more importantly, as the world grew and trade exploded, there wasn't enough gold to keep up with the sheer volume of human ambition. The turning point happened in August 1971. President Richard Nixon officially ended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. In an instant, the world's reserve currency went to being fiat money. Fiat is Latin for "let it be done." It means the money in your pocket has value simply because the government says it does. It is backed by nothing more than a collective social contract, a pinky promise between 330 million Americans and the rest of the world. This was the moment the printer was finally unshackled. For the first time in history, we had a global financial system based entirely on trust. And this is where psychology gets interesting. Because if money is just a promise, what happens when the government starts making too many promises? What happens when they realize that they can create value out of thin air to pay for wars, or social programs, or to bail out banks? The reason we can't just print more is that the moment we print too much, the trust evaporates. And once the trust is gone, the paper goes back to being exactly what it was always meant to be: just paper. To understand why we can't just print more money, you first have to understand a secret. The government doesn't actually print most of the money. When we hear the phrase printing money, we usually picture a massive industrial press in a basement, churning out crisp $100 bills. But in the modern world, that's just a metaphor. Physical cash, the stuff you can actually touch, makes up only about 3% to 5% of the total money supply. The other 95%, it's nothing more than numbers on a screen. It's digital ghost money. To understand how this ghost money is created, we have to look at two specific magic tricks used by the financial system. The first trick belongs to the central bank in the United States. That's the Federal Reserve. When the government decides the economy needs more money, they don't call a printing factory. They perform something called open market operations. Imagine the Federal Reserve wants to inject $1 billion into the economy. They don't just hand it out. They go to a large commercial bank like JP Morgan or Wells Fargo and they say, "We'd like to buy $1 billion worth of your government bonds." The bank agrees. But where does the Fed get the $1 billion to pay for those bonds? This is the part that feels like a glitch in the matrix. They simply type it into existence. They don't have a vault with that money. They just edit a digital spreadsheet. They increase the balance of the commercial bank's account at the Fed, and in exchange, the Fed takes the bonds. Suddenly, the commercial bank has $1 billion new dollars it didn't have yesterday. This is often called quantitative easing, and it's the closest thing to a magic wand in the human world. The second magic trick happens at your local bank branch, and it's called fractional reserve banking. Most people think that when they deposit $1,000 into a bank, the bank puts that cash into a vault and keeps it there. Under the law, a bank only has to keep a tiny fraction of your money, let's say 10%, in reserve. They take the other 90%, $900, and they lend it out to someone else to buy a car or start a business. Now, here's the mind-bending part. You still have $1,000 in your account. You can see it on your app. You can spend it. But the person who borrowed the $900 also has $900 in their account. Total money in the system, $1,900. This cycle repeats. That $900 loan gets spent and deposited into another bank. That bank keeps $90 and lends out $810. This is the money multiplier effect. One single $1,000 bill can theoretically create $10,000 of digital money as it bounces through the banking system. If this sounds like a giant game of musical chairs, that's because it is. If everyone in the country went to the bank tomorrow and tried to withdraw their digital cash at the same time, the system would collapse. There literally isn't enough physical paper in existence to cover the numbers on our screens. This is a bank run, and it's the stuff of economic nightmares. So, if money is this easy to create, if it's just digital typing and bank loans, why can't we just do it forever? Why can't the Fed just type an extra zero on everyone's balance? The answer lies in the difference between currency and value. Currency is the language we use to talk about value. If the government prints twice as much money, they aren't creating more value. They are just changing the dictionary. They are making the words cheaper. If you have a pizza cut into 8 slices, and you decide to cut it into 16 slices instead, you don't have more pizza. You just have smaller slices. When the government prints more money, they are essentially cutting the economic pizza into smaller and smaller slices. Every new dollar typed into a spreadsheet makes the dollar already in your pocket slightly less powerful. This leads us to the most terrifying word in economics, a word that has destroyed empires and toppled kings: inflation. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and every single person in the country has an extra $10,000 in their bank account. The government didn't raise taxes. They just typed the numbers into existence and hit send. For about 6 hours, the mood is ecstatic. People quit their jobs. They head to the car dealership. They finally book that vacation to the Maldives. But then reality hits. The car dealer isn't stupid. He sees the line of people outside his door, all clutching their new digital wealth. He only has 12 cars on the lot. If he sells them at yesterday's prices, he'll be sold out in 20 minutes and won't have enough money to buy new inventory from the factory because the factory is also raising its prices. So, he doubles the price of the cars. Then he triples them. This is the inflationary monster, in its simplest form. Too much money, chasing too few goods. Economist Milton Friedman famously argued that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But he also pointed out something more cynical. Inflation is a tax. When the government wants to build a new bridge or fund a war, they usually have 2 honest options. They can raise your taxes, or they can borrow money and pay it back later with interest. Both options are unpopular. They require debates, votes, and angry constituents. But there is a third, dishonest option. They can just print the money. When they do this, they aren't taking your physical dollar bills out of your pocket. Instead, they are taking the purchasing power of those bills. If you had $100 in a jar that could buy 100 loaves of bread yesterday, but after the government prints more money, that same $100 can only buy 80 loaves. The government has essentially taxed you 20 loaves of bread without ever passing a law. It is a silent, invisible redistribution of wealth. The government gets the new money first before prices have risen, and they spend it at yesterday's value. By the time that money filters down to you, the prices have already spiked. You are the last person to the party, and you're the one left with the bill. This is where the math turns into a psychological horror movie. Once inflation starts, it creates a feedback loop called the wage-price spiral. You see the price of milk going up, so you go to your boss and demand a 10% raise just to keep your head above water. Your boss, seeing his labor costs go up, raises the price of the products his company sells to cover your new salary. Now, everyone else sees those prices going up and demands their own raises. Around and around it goes. It's a race where the finish line keeps moving. But the most damaging part isn't what happens to your paycheck, it's what happens to your savings. In a healthy economy, we are taught to be responsible. We save for retirement. We put money in the bank for our children's education. But inflation punishes responsibility. If inflation is 10% and your bank account only pays 1% interest, you are effectively losing 9% of your wealth every year just by being safe. This creates a use it or lose it mentality. People stop saving and start panic buying. They buy anything that isn't cash. Gold, real estate, even extra cans of soup, because they know the paper money is rotting in their hands. This frantic spending only makes inflation worse, pushing the monster faster and faster until it starts to run. At some point, the monster stops being a nuisance and becomes a predator. We call this hyperinflation. This isn't just higher prices. This is the total collapse of the social contract. In the early 2000s, the Zimbabwean government began a radical land reform program, seizing thousands of productive commercial farms. In an instant, the nation's primary source of food and export income vanished. Manufacturing plummeted by nearly 30% a year. The government was now broke, but it still had bills to pay. It had a massive army, a sprawling civil service, and a mounting pile of debt. Since they couldn't grow food or collect taxes, they did the only thing the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe knew how to do. They hit the print button. By November 2008, the annual inflation rate reached an incomprehensible 89.7 sextillion%. That is a 9 followed by 22 zeros. At this peak, prices were doubling every 24.7 hours. The Reserve Bank began a desperate race against the clock. They printed $10 million notes, then $100 million, then $10 billion. Finally, in early 2009, they released the final boss of currency, the $100 trillion note. I remember boarding a bus to town to withdraw my salary of 1 billion Zimbabwe dollars, recalls Epiphania Mudewe, a midwife from Mutare. By the time I stood in line at the supermarket, the exchange rate had shifted so fast that my entire month's salary was worth less than a cent. I couldn't even afford the bus fare back home. I had to walk 3 hours in the heat, carrying $1 billion that couldn't buy a roll of toilet paper. The collapse was so fast that the technology literally couldn't keep up. ATMs at major banks began flashing data overflow error and shutting down because their software wasn't programmed to handle the number of zeros required for a simple withdrawal. Psychologically, the nation entered a state of resilient exhaustion. People became hungry billionaires. You would see people walking down the street with gym bags stuffed with cash, not because they were rich, but because they were going to buy a gallon of milk. In this chaos, the only winners were the elite who had access to foreign currency. They would use the official and fake government exchange rate to buy United States dollars for pennies, then sell those dollars on the black market for trillions of Zimbabwean marks. They bought Mercedes-Benzes for the equivalent of 25 pounds, while the rest of the country ate one meal a day. Eventually, the people simply stopped. They refused to use the paper. They began spontaneous dollarization, trading in United States dollars, South African rand, or even bags of grain. The government was forced to officially abandon the currency in 2009. Today, the $100 trillion note, the symbol of one of the greatest policy failures in human history, is one of the best performing investments on eBay. Collectors buy them for $100 or $200 as a reminder of what happens when a government treats the printing press like a magic wand. For the people of Zimbabwe, however, those notes are the scars of a decade where trillions meant nothing. Money is the most successful religion in human history. It is a story we all tell each other, and as long as we all believe the story at the same time, it is true. This is the social contract of value. When you accept $1 as payment for your work, you aren't accepting it because you like the portrait of George Washington. You are accepting it because you have a 100% faith-based belief that tomorrow someone else, a landlord, a baker, a mechanic, will also accept it. Money is a "I owe you" from society. It is a claim on the future labor of a stranger. This is what economists mean when they talk about fiat. It means by decree. It works because we have delegated the management of our truth to a central authority. We have collectively agreed to let the government be the referee of the game. If you look at a dollar, or a euro, or a pound, you won't see a promise to pay you in gold. In the United States, the backing of the currency is officially called the full faith and credit of the United States. But what does that actually mean? It's a fancy way of saying three things. The power to tax. The government can demand you pay your taxes in that specific currency. If you don't, they have the power to put you in jail. This creates a forced demand for the money. Everyone needs it because everyone owes the government. The military. The currency is backed by the most powerful organization on earth. A stable currency requires a stable border and a stable law. The global receipt. Because the world uses the dollar to buy oil, electronics, and medicine, the trust isn't just local, it's planetary. But here is the catch. Trust is not a renewable resource. It is a battery that can be drained. The psychology of trust is binary. It's a light switch. As long as the switch is on, the system feels indestructible. You can print billions, you can run deficits, and the world keeps turning because everyone still believes the pinky promise is valid. But if the switch flips to off, it happens in an instant. This is what we call a crisis of confidence. Imagine you are standing in a crowded theater. Everyone is sitting calmly because they believe the building is safe. That belief is what keeps the theater functioning. But if one person smells smoke and screams fire, the belief evaporates. It doesn't matter if there is an actual fire or not. The fear of the fire creates the stampede. When a government prints too much money, they are essentially blowing smoke into the theater. At first, people ignore it. They want to believe the movie is still going. But eventually, the smell becomes too strong. People look at their savings, they look at the rising prices of eggs and gas, and they realize the pinky promise is being broken. Why can't we just print more money? Because money is a mirror of our productivity. If we print more money without producing more stuff, we are just lying to the mirror. We are trying to trick ourselves into thinking we are richer than we are. History shows us that the mirror always wins. You can't print a better life. You can't print a more prosperous nation. You can only build those things with time, labor, and innovation. Money is just the tool we use to keep track of that effort. The next time you look at a banknote, don't see it as wealth. See it as a ticket of trust. It is a fragile, beautiful, and terrifying agreement between you and 8 billion other people. And the only thing keeping it from turning back into a useless piece of paper is the fact that you still believe in it. So, the next time your inner 7-year-old asks, why don't they just print more money? You finally have the answer. It's because the machine doesn't make money, it makes promises. And a promise is only valuable if it's rare. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the psychology of the printing press, consider subscribing. We're going to be exploring more of the invisible systems that run our world. And in the meantime, maybe keep an eye on the baker. If he starts asking for virtual gold or wheelbarrows, you'll know the movie is over.